Yeah. Okay. Good day to you all, and welcome to this Friends of Multilateralism group session on trade and for peace. This is first time we do a subject like this, and the simple thing, and also as my personal statement as CEO of FMG, is that I mean, me and probably some others, we more or less grow up and grow old in a peaceful period. So quite often we take peace for granted, and suddenly, and we be looking around what is going on, and what may be popping up here and there, which may lead to serious conflict. We we begin to wonder what is going wrong, and as WTO and trade experts, we begin to wonder how we can deal with that and how trade can play a role for peacekeeping, humanitarian work, so on and so forth. So I think that's what we are going to learn today. Our moderator, Axel, is right now at another meeting. He will be joining us soon. So before that, I will humbly take over temporarily his moderation role. And I will first give the floor to Roberta, and to be followed by Serge and then Simon. Their CVs are shared on with our invitation and in the notice we have sent out. So I won't spend any time introduce them. I will go directly to Roberta. Would you like to start now? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Xiankun. Good afternoon to everybody, and actually thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here presenting at the Friends of Multilateralism. I've heard of it many times thanks to my ex-boss, Patrick, who's here. And so it's a great honor. I hope to join the group once I'm retired. So, so let me start with sort of telling you about trade and peace at the WTO. So I'm working in I'm a chief of applied economic research at the WTO. So I'm an economist, and about 3 years ago we started this project together with the accession division at the WTO. Looking a bit into the context, exactly the context you were describing before, a context where we all know that trade and peace are strongly linked with each other. We know historically that the link between and the nexus between trade and peace has been at the origin of the European Economic Commission, ASEAN. It's also the GATT was originally a sort of a peace project in a way, coming out from the war, and after that was preceded by the breakdown of the global trading system. Somehow there was the idea that reviving trade was a mean through which maintain and sustain peace. So, and probably if we look back at what happened since GATT, since after the creation of WTO, we probably have a period, at least in some of the major countries involved in the war before, peace. But more recently, we've seen increase in number of conflicts, increase in tensions, and so I think understanding properly how these links between trade and peace work is actually part of our responsibility. And so from here, the idea of a publication that look at how do trade and peace interact, and what can governments do to make this interaction a positive relationship. So what we have done is a publication, which is the first WTO publication on trade and peace, titled Pathways to Sustainable Trade and Peace. And I think there are 3 important novelties to highlight in this publication. One is that it's focused, even if not exclusively, on fragile and conflict affected states. And this, there is a clear interest from the WTO because a large of the new acceding countries is actually among the fragile and conflict states, even the last two acceding countries. Second, the second novelty is actually that this is a volume that collects 16 chapters, 31 authors, and it's the outcome of collaboration of WTO with a number of other partner institutions, international organizations. And authors have a diverse background. They are economists, they are peace building experts, and they are practitioners that actually work in fragile settings. So, and this is my view particularly interesting because what we realize is that despite trade and peace have interactions, people that work on trade and people that work on peace don't speak to each other. So I think this publication is a way to sort of start a conversation between these different communities. And the third contribution of the paper is that it comes up with a variety of evidence, case studies, sort of insights that can be used by policymakers to actually have guidance on policies or to use as an argument for the right policies. There's one key message in the report, and it is that trade is indispensable for peace. It's part of building a peace process. It can be important to end conflict, to deal with post-conflict healing, to sustain peace, to prevent wars. And in the report, there are some evidence that actually, for instance, WTO membership and GSP preferences have been positively affected peace processes. But trade alone is not enough. And so to actually have a sort of a peaceful world, the world that we hopefully want to live in, the trade community needs to work with other partners. And the report in particular will highlight some element, the importance, for example, of macroeconomic stabilities. So for trade people to work with macro people, the importance of having strong institutions so that agreements are perceived as fair when they're finalized, the important role of business, because business, if they are inclusive, they actually can build trust, and this can help also reaching markets abroad. Looking ahead, sort of we realize that this is just a first stone into the discussion and in this interaction. So clearly the report recognizes that much more needs to be done. We need more research, we need more elements to build this puzzle of the right interaction, where we do hope we can actually start from here and maybe from today to begin a discussion between different parties that can successfully build synergies for a positive trade and peace link. So with this in mind, I give the floor to Axel Addy, who is also the author of one of the chapters. And thank you very much for your attention and for being here.
Thank you very much, Roberta, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. It is always a pleasure to interact with all of you. Roberta, I think, have framed the publication, and so I would like to just add to her reflection and take a moment to situate our discussion within the broader context in which this work emerges. So distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, at a time when the global trading system is challenged by geopolitical tensions, economic fragmentation, and declining trust in a multilateral cooperation, the Trade for Peace publication offers a timely reflection on how trade can be more deliberate to shape advanced peace, stability, and inclusive development. What stands out about the publication is its effort to break down traditional silos, which Roberta has spoken about, between trade, peace, and development communities. It recognizes that sustainable peace depends on economic opportunity and social inclusion, while open and rules-based trade relies on stability, trust, and effective governance. I believe by grounding this idea in data-driven, regional, and country-level experiences, the publication attempts to reframe trade as a systematic enabler for resilience. It demonstrates how trade openness, when paired with good institutions, can help rebuild economies emerging from conflict, like Liberia, reinforce accountability and transparency, and foster a sense of shared purpose that discourages relapse into violence. At the same time, it reminds us that these positive outcomes depend on inclusive policymaking, credible governance, and equitable participation in global markets. With this introduction in mind, it is my pleasure to welcome our two distinguished speakers. Sergey Strubont, and forgive me if I mispronounce, the director for Europe and the MENA region at the Institute for Economics and Peace, and one of the contributor to the publication. And Simon Evenet, professor of geopolitics and strategy at the International Institute for Management Development, IMD. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And to open our discussion today, we'll begin with presentations by our two presenters, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answer. I would now like to invite, in the interest of time, giving the participation, I would like to invite our panelists, whom both will have 10 minutes for their presentation. And so, Sergey, or is it Sergey or Serge?
Serge.
My apologies.
No
Serge,
problem.
You have the floor. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much again for having me, and really enjoying this cooperation between WTO and the Institute for Economics and Peace. And now FMG is also part of this collaboration. So good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me. What I'm going to do is, first of all, share my screen and make sure that I can talk to you for the next 10 minutes about why it is important to, how should I say this, to also why it is important to measure peace and to know what we're talking about. Of course, you can have these trade indicators that most of you are used to work with, but I think it's also good to know what impact it can have on peace, what peace can have impact on trade, and how both are interrelated or systemically connected. So maybe first of all, before I start, for those who do not know the Institute for Economics and Peace, so we are a global think tank based out of Sydney, Australia, with offices throughout the world. I'm leading the office in Brussels. So what we do is measure and quantify peace, and also identify the economic benefits coming along with a more peaceful situation. To talk about peace, we measure two types of peacefulness. It's negative and positive peace. Negative peace would be the absence of violence or the fear of violence, and we measure that with the Global Peace Index. And from the very start of the Institute for Economics and Peace, about 20 years ago, we ask ourselves the question, so it's nice to have the figures, it's nice to have the measurement, but how can you influence the levels of peacefulness? Which type of investments do you need to make in peace? And eventually, and I will show that very quickly during my presentation, we came to the conclusion that positive peace for us is something that can be empirical, measured, really with data. It's a systemic definition of peace, looking at institutions, structures, and attitudes. We have seen over the past 15 years that institutions and structures are there. Hence also the collaboration today of an international organization such as the World Trade Organization. But the attitudes have changed clearly in all aspects at levels of geopolitical level, but also in the individual attitudes that we bring to bear every day. So what we have seen with positive peace is that once you invest in positive peace and you have higher levels of positive peace, you also see that the majority of all economic indicators, such as foreign direct investment, household consumption, a faster growing GDP, better credit rates, better interest rates, better credit ratings, also those are all the economic benefits coming along with a more peaceful situation. Next to the fact that your resilience is increasing, all forms of resilience are increasing together also with your levels of happiness and well-being. So those are the things that I'm going to talk about today. And clearly, if you want to understand something, I think you need to measure it. At least that's what we need to say. And what I want to share also before getting into the details of my presentation is the mantra that I have been using for the past 9 to 12 months, where, coming out of Brussels here, the only thing you hear is that you need to prepare for war to achieve peace. Well, through positive peace, I can also say that if you want to achieve peace, you can just invest in peace, right? You can also choose this path instead of the other one. So I guess I already answered that question. There is a necessity to measure peace, to measure negative and positive peace. That's what we do. When we look at the global peace index, I think, Axel, I can only confirm what you have said. We also see at the global level political fragmentation leading to the highest number of conflicts throughout the world since the Second World War. We also see the highest number of countries engaged in the conflict outside of their borders. And we also see that minor conflicts today, out of the 59 that we see, the minor conflicts that the majority of them also have the potential to worsen and to become a major conflict in the future. About 5 to 6 years ago, countries like Ukraine, Palestine, and Ethiopia were minor conflicts, under 1,000 casualties per year. This has clearly changed over the past 5 years. So what we need to do is understand why conflict is there, these dynamics, but also understand what you need to do, when you need to intervene, and try to solve conflicts when it's easier to be done, when there are still minor conflicts and we have a lower number of casualties also. So that's the type of research we do. Color code, you can click on each of the countries on our website, giving you all the data on those 23 indicators we use to measure negative peace. So we're looking at the conflict impact, so the ongoing conflict, internal and external conflict. We have a set of indicators for internal safety and security. So we look inside, so how peaceful is your own society. And then, of course, we look at levels of militarization. So that's for the negative peace. And what do we see there is that last year we had again a deterioration, and you will see that this was the 13th deterioration in 17 years, and these deteriorations mostly generated by conflict and the cost of conflict also. And as you can see, more countries became less peaceful than countries which increased the levels of peacefulness also. So 13 deterioration over 17 years, you can clearly see it's a little bit counterintuitive, but when the graph is going up, it's basically becoming less peaceful. And as I said, mostly driven by conflict, but we have seen a change in trend in the past 2-3 years, where the change in trend, a clear one, because for the past decade there was a disinvestment in the military, in militarization. More than 100 countries invested less in their military in the 10 years before this change of trend. In the past 2-3 years, we have seen a complete reverse effect, where more than 105 countries starting to invest more into their military. And what we have also seen, measuring the Global Peace Index 2025, especially for Europe, it's not only about investing more, but it's also about investing better. The example of Europe shows that the investment is 400% higher than the one Russia is producing, but the output is only 30% higher. In times where budgets are tight, and when you need to find money to reinvest into your defense, I think you ought to also be very efficient in the way you use your money, especially if you cut down on diplomatic and also on development budgets, and also on if you cut down on all the internal budget, which basically stands for a strong social tissue. I'm talking about education, about health, about social matters. Clearly the money we need to invest in defense it needs to come from somewhere. Well, we know where it's coming from. It's diplomacy, it's development, and all those other ministries, all those other departments, which eventually will give a guarantee for a strong social tissue. So clearly there we need to know what's going on and where we are going. That's clearly showing you the evolution over the past years. So many more conflicts are being fought. The intensity is much higher. eventually, and that's maybe the good news, we see that the total conflict death has decreased in the past 4 to 5 years also globally. Well to understand that also. If we continue, so that was negative piece. And really the conclusion for this year is this global fragmentation, the highest number of conflict, a very high number, almost the highest number of countries involved in the conflict outside of the borders. It's around 80, has been to a peak of 93 the year before. And what we also see is clearly a problem of militarization, reinvestment, taking away, I would say, financial assets from those peace building measures like diplomacy, like development, and all the other I would say departments that I already explained to you. Positive peace, asset, attitude, institution, structures could be considered, this index could be considered as an alternative measure of resilience. We also know that the SDG, for 60% of the SDGs, it's very difficult to find indicators or data sets which are valid for the measurement of the SDGs. Well, the positive peace index somehow is showing you a potential for a resilience measurement. And we use this in a lot of our analysis, especially when it comes to when we create indexes like the Global Terrorism Index, which is focusing on the impact, when we create the ecological threat report, really looking at the ecological impact. Well, what we try to always bring to as an example there is to look at the level of resilience of countries to continue to absorb the shocks they are exposed to. And I think when especially in the measure of ecological degradation, we see that of course some countries are really exposed to a high number of different ecological threats at a high level also, but still are quite resilient to absorb those shocks on their own, right? While on the other hand, and that's what we call the hotspot, for example, we see countries with a less important impact, ecological impact, but really levels of resilience close to zero. And when you bring those two together, I think the risk of social implosion because of the exposure to the impact will be much higher, or this risk will be much higher than to other countries which already receive climate funding, but should not get it at the moment because they can still cope themselves with the impact they are facing. So I think the measurement of the reason for this positive peace research was, of course, to see next to the fact, when you have a global peace index, it's just like nice to have information. Thank you for providing us all those measurements. Thank you for providing all those figures. And now what do we do? So what? Well, positive peace is a clear answer to that, where you are so positive is explaining to you how systemically creating peace, creating peaceful and sustainably peaceful societies also. And as I said to you before, what we have seen through this research is like when your levels of positive peace are increasing or are high, we see a faster growing GDP and all the other economic indicators also increasing. So when I talk about violence, well, this has a price. This comes at a cost, right? And this cost has been evaluated to almost 20 trillion last year. So this is about close to 11.5%, 12% of the world GDP, about $2,500 per person paid on violence last year. And of course, this is higher than the per capita income for more than 40 countries in the world. And what is really striking there is actually the distribution of this cost. What we see there, and of course, this is something different. This is a slide showing you the increase in military expenditure. I would say in PPP, but also in the percentage of increase between 23 and 24. When we look at the distribution of this cost of violence, or the economic value of peace, so to speak, when you look at the flip side of the same coin, what we see there is that more than 75%, about 80% of the investment made in violence is made in violence containment. So we see 45% for the military, 30% for internal security forces like police and paramilitary or national guards. And we see a growing percentage being spent there, of this money being spent also to private military and security companies, the Wagners of this world. Well, that's a political choice. Where do you want to put your money? Do you want to put your money, invest in peaceful solutions, or do you want to continue create some, I would call them like vicious cycles in which violence is being almost fostered or not addressed as it should be? I think when you want to create a peaceful world, and that's of course what IEP is trying to explain every time we produce a report like this or we talk about peace. The idea is to create those virtual cycles with high levels of positive peace, therefore lower levels of frustration and grievances within societies, but also in between societies, leading to less violence. So you need to invest less in violence containment, and those financial assets can be re-injected into the economy, into development, and positive measures increasing also continuously increasing the levels of positive peace. So what we see there is this need to start creating those virtual cycles leading to more peacefulness and eventually also more trade. As I said, foreign direct investment will be higher, household consumptions, and the connection between parties will be much higher also, with higher levels of peacefulness. So of course, as I explained to you, there is an effect on the global economy. We see that the global trade has a plateau of around 60% of global GDP over the past decade. So, and Axel, you also spoke about economic fragmentation. I think it's fragmentation at all levels of geopolitics and geoeconomics. We see, of course, that the economic landscape of geopolitics in the 21st century, we now see the tariffs, we see the competition, the same competition we see at political level or at the level of international relations. So this, I would say, this trade atmosphere is also impacted by the new rules for international relations in which we are. So, and as you have said, also this, or I think it's you, Roberta, who spoke about this mistrust into international organizations, into what a lot of people would call organization of the past, because these international organization and international law were assets that were into a liberal system, making sure that peace was central, the human was central, and then you could build all the interconnections around that centerpiece. Now, the human is not central, it's really survival of the state, it's competition, no collaboration, and definitely peace is just a nice to have when it is supporting the development of your interests. So we see a completely different approach to relations between countries, both at economic level or both at trade level, and also in the international relations and peaceful relations between countries. Therefore, I think when we measure peace, and that's what we hope, that's why part of my job is basically outreach, creation of partnerships, and basically go out to the institutions. I mean, we have an office in Brussels. I can see the EU from my office. I have a colleague in New York, close to the UN. So we try to deliver through the research we are doing the figures, the measurements, the facts when it comes to peace and the interrelationships to other aspects of international relations. We want to inform the policymakers and decision makers, and we also, by doing so, strengthened institutional resilience, making sure that those institutions can make the best decisions based on the best research to do so. So, of course, I mean, this is a slide that is always in my presentation, and I need to tell you that, of course, I work for the best think tank in the world. We are really great people. So jokes apart, thank you for the time that was allocated to me. Thank you for listening to me. And thank you for continuously include IEP in this Trade for Peace program. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Very, very thought-provoking presentation. As you were speaking, and I saw the one chart you presented, I looked at expenditure on in terms of military expenditure, and the U.S. seemed to either has quadrupled the rest of the world in terms of military expenditure. Hopefully, we can get back to how you look at those numbers in are those aggregates, including sales of military hardware, or just direct expenditure by the military. Those are some of the things I was thinking about as you did the presentation. I don't want to hold on too much because I know we have a long conversation. I want to save time for conversation. So I would like to actually invite Simon to present, and then we can open the floor for a conversation, and so that we can have more time for dialogue. So Simon, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Axel. And I want to congratulate the WTO Secretariat on getting this huge volume out. All 16 chapters are really worth looking at. Congratulations to the authors. In essence, the issues sort of break down into two parts. One, can we identify individual cases where trade has contributed to peace or to reconstruction, and under what circumstances that takes place. And I think we've heard from Roberta that the answer is normally always very contingent and qualified, but that doesn't make it any less interesting. It just highlights the fact that trade can contribute. I've just been this morning in Geneva with a team of my MBAs who've been looking at the contribution of the reconstruction of Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement, and I think the only fair conclusion is that there is zero contribution of cross-border trade and investment to this. And here, the story and explanation is pretty simple. It's hard to attract lots of foreign direct investment to a de-risk Northern Ireland when to your south is the Celtic Tiger of the Republic of Ireland. And so again, we get to see that circumstances matter. And so I think we cannot, I think, claim too much, and I don't think the book claims too much either. I don't want to spend too much time on the individual cases because I do think they're important, but I'm not sure there's general lessons there. I think the first order issues before us also are the ones that you raised, Axel, about what's going on at the systemic level these days in the global trading system, where we do seem to be seeing an evolution in the relationship between trade and peace, or at least tensions between countries. Let's not forget that in September of this year, Chancellor Merz went on record saying, "We are not at war, but we are no longer at peace." And he's very much referring to the developments, of course, in Western Europe in the context of Russia and what he sees as the threat to the East. And so policymakers, I think, are beginning to move, senior policymakers are moving very quickly towards a posture that we have moved out of a peaceful situation. And I think they are also beginning to attribute this deterioration in relations and these threats of war partly to the trading system. And let me put on the table just two examples. The first comes from an interview I did with a senior defense executive in the US defense industry who had served in the Pentagon, actually as the chief of staff for General Mattis when General Mattis was defense secretary. And I was asking him about how his company was dealing with geopolitics. Before we even got into this, he took the view that he was going to give me a lecture on how he sees the world. And he asked me to plot a chart of China's rising share of merchandise trade and world trade. And he said, "I bet you, Simon, think that's a good thing." And I said I did, and I explained why. Then he asked me to plot China's gross national income as a share of American national income. And that rises too. And once you correct for differences in prices, China has already overtaken the United States. And he said, "I bet you think that's a good thing too, Simon." And then I said yes. And I told an export-led growth story, pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And he said, "Yep, that's exactly what I expected you to say." And he said, "And now let me show you a chart of China's military expenditure as a share of US military expenditure. When China joined the WTO, that China spent about 5 to 7% of the American level. Now it spends a third." And his conclusion was, your globalization, as in Simon's globalization, has allowed another country to grow so fast that it is now a first-order military threat to my country. Okay? If that thinking is at all pervasive, and I must say it's not the only time I've heard that thinking in this past year or so, then the relationship between trade and peace, or trade and threats to national security, is being rethought. And the very export-led growth that many of us have championed, is because of countries then using some of that extra revenue to finance greater military expenditure. This is seen then as a threat, ultimately, to peace. And this is, I think, a line of inquiry we will need to think about and come up with an answer to. The second reason why I think senior policymakers' views on trade and peace are evolving is precisely because of all the weaponization of trade that we've begun to see. The very links between countries, which developed over time precisely because of all the liberalization, which all of us championed, and I would still champion to this day, has enabled some governments to try from time to time to weaponize or restrict either supplies of goods and services or market access as a form of economic coercion. And essentially, I'm reminded of Clausewitz's point that He said war is the continuation of politics by other means, but essentially on the path towards war, there are lots of ways in which governments can can try to influence each other, including coercive measures through the trading system. On top of this, we have one other example which came out very recently, and that is the people of Denmark and Norway who recently discovered that the school buses which take their children to school have kill switches in them, which were installed by their producers from the country which they source them from, and that country is not a geopolitical ally. And so this has then raised questions about continuity of supply and whether or not openness has induced threats either to, in the case of transport system, but more generally to critical infrastructures. So what I want to submit to my friends, and I'm, as many of you know, a broad supporter of the trading system, is that opinion is moving fast on the relationship between trade, openness, and peace and threats to security, national security. And I'm not sure that we are moving fast enough to be able to think nimbly about how we can either put in place new either practices or procedures which ensure that trade is not seen as a threat, or to find, I don't know, how can I put this, agreements or norms whereby certain degrees of restraint is shown. Because I think the direction of travel of this debate about trade and peace is not the direction that is characterized in this book. This book is very valuable, and it characterizes the normative position I would like to support, but I suspect that that is not how many people are now connecting the dots. And I think the rise of interest in this concept of economic security is a reflection of the fact that the trading system is no longer being seen as being complementary to peace and harmonious relations between nations. Let me leave it there and see if others wish to respond.
Axel, you are muted, Axel.
Thank you, Lou. Simon, I think very, very thought-provoking insights. When I think about the two arguments you've made, the both of you have made, I think about the context of developing countries. We would talk about trade and peace, and we talk about the weaponization of trade. And there's an old African saying that when elephants fight, the grass suffer. And so you have a situation where the elephants are at war, and so there's massive fragmentation at all levels. And because of that, it's triggered more conflict in developing countries and pushed more people into poverty. In terms of how you measure, trade and peace in that context, where conflict is not at the level of sophistication of firing missiles, but people going to arms, at a very lower level. I'll be interested in learning more about when you talk about measuring peace and the impact of trade and peace. What are some lessons that we can explore in terms of how do you advise developing countries? They're the majority of the multilateral trading system. How do you convince them to believe in the multilateral trading system when they're the grass that are suffering from the fights of the elephant? They're seeing higher prices. The cost, supply chains disruption are seeing huge inflations in the country that's pushed a lot of people into poverty, has disrupted their economies. Many of them are now pushing to sort of commandeer concessions around critical minerals. So, I almost feel sorry for finance minister. I can shed you a little bit of light on the Liberia situation. In the Liberia situation, the conflict for a long time was fueled by access to raw materials. You had 4 or 5 warring factions that refused to come to the table to negotiate peace because they were sitting on huge natural resource deposits on various export concessions, and there were buyers on the market in spite of the different embargoes imposed on the country. That fueled the conflict for many times. I mean, there were splinters. The conflict escalated from 2 warring factions to 4 warring factions, and then after a while you lost count. But one thing that makes the Liberia story a little bit different is, one, Liberia had a culture of peace for over a century and had never seen this escalation. First of all, from 1980 to 1989, the then government has scaled up military investment, military spending, which has never been done in the past. Um, because again, there was a move towards, again, tribalizing conflict, which created deep tension that made it almost difficult to get to peace. What changed the Liberian equation is actually civil society advocacy. When the women in Liberia decided, okay, enough is enough, that these people are becoming wealthy of the conflict, and the hidden hands beneficiaries who are buying Liberia's rubber, Liberia timber, and benefiting from this conflict, it was in their interests for it to continue. Now let's move fast forward to the DRC today, where it's probably the richest country per square mile in the world, but has existed in this turbulence and fragmentation, insecurity for several decades. Why? And we see more and more of this going to happen as, again, the elephants are at war. So as we talk about trade and peace, in this fragmentation, if we were to advise, the LDC group today, um, in terms of what is in it for them in terms of the multilateral trading system, when those who should respect the rules and be protected of the rules are drawing new lines that leave them out of the equation, where they actually are seeing the side effect and the negative benefit of the negative impact on their economies. Liberia will bounce back, due to civil society push to get parties to peace negotiations. A peace accord will be signed with all the warring factions in agreement to not with an agreement that pretty much, and I would like to hear more from you and Simon on this, where the agreement to sustain peace in Liberia protected those who perpetrated the war on the citizens and caused the loss of over 250,000 lives. Those players, many of them transitioned into politics, won elections in their areas, and to this day, in many ways, they've taken off their uniform, but in many ways, they control power. So the country have had 2 decades of peace because those who typically would have gone back to the bushes have become quite wealthy and powerful and are actually impacting the direction of the country. What measurement looks at that to make a case for why trade is important? I mean, you look at Liberia, you say, okay, we're exporting. Stability has led to a revenue growth. Revenue growth has led to more stable institutions. So yes, Simon, you talk about measuring peace and positive peace. Yeah, we have stronger institutions, but that growth hasn't led to the kind of inclusion of the general population, which keeps the risk of returning to conflict forever present. And so I would like to open the floor with those remarks. I would like to open the floor for points, questions to the 2 panelists. Thank you. I see Roberta first, and then Hamid second. Roberta, we'll start with you.
Just wanted to sort of break the ice. I'm sure that after many questions will follow. I have a couple of questions. One question is, so I was wondering, why would anyone sort of start a war or colonize another country, for instance, to get resources, natural resources, if they could simply get it in the market, which is what trade does? And the second question is, if the fault of the market, or is it something we need to figure out, or something else we need to figure out? So that's one question, and sort of story, which was I wrote some time ago a report on trade, poverty, and so on, and there the issue of the ability to sell resources in some countries being the reason why you have a war. And somehow, if I take the example of my family, if I inherited jewelries and I can sell it in the market for a high price, it's a great deal. Of course, I have a problem with my sister if I don't deal this properly. And so somehow here it seems to me that we confuse what is the cause of the problem. Is the cause the opportunity to have a market where to sell jewelries, or the fact that I didn't maybe before selling jewelry agree with my sister what the conditions are? And if somebody gets in the market and use the money, then for a purpose, for a certain purpose, maybe for security, don't we need a system, global system or shadow rule? I mean, we have UN National Security Council, but so is the sort of the big issue I have is, and I fail to understand, is why do we assign the cause to trade? You know, the situations that seem not obvious to me.
Thank you, Roberta. Then we have Hamid next.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Axel, and thank you, Simon and Sergey, for the fascinating presentations. What Simon said is quite important, actually, and I just wanted to understand that a bit better with respect to this narrative about globalization giving rise to threats, military threats in the form of China. And my question here is that kind of narrative unique to a hegemonic perspective that sees a threat? Or could this concern of globalization and expansion of trade opportunities represent a threat to peace, which is what seems to be that narrative? Could that be generalized or expanded beyond the case of the United States? Again, that's a question, or is it just this situation that lends itself to that description? The second point, I think, which is also a question, is about even when we have expansion of trade opportunities and more prosperity, there seems to be questions of governance issues or good governance, which is what Roberta described as an agreement with a sister about how to divide the family jewels. Do we need to pay more attention to how distributional policies are being managed? And if so, then what would be the best way to go about that? Because I think this is also one of the concerns that a lot of the anti-globalization voices really complain about, that it's about, not everyone is benefiting. Anyway, two questions that keep lingering, but thank you so much for the excellent presentations. Back to you, Axel.
Thank you, Hamid. We'll do the third question and then we'll revert to Simon and Sergey to respond. Lou, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Axel. Just two quick questions. The first one to follow up on what Hamid just mentioned about this example that Simon mentioned in his presentation of this gentleman referring to the China case, increasing its military expenditure from 1 to 3% to 1/3 of the US level, and which he called a kind of threat. So I just don't see the logic here, because naturally when countries, especially countries like China and other developed countries, which were subject to a lot of colonization or invasion, when they become richer, and then they naturally invest more into their own defense. So I don't see why that become a threat. If such a, increase of investment into self-defense is a threat, to the level of 1/3, and then that 100% kind of a bigger level of expenditure itself, is that a bigger threat? So that's the first thing. Just try to understand the logic here. The second thing, we have been discussing the relationship between trade and peace. I mean, if we turn over a little bit the coin, trying to look at how trade and trade relations help with peace, I don't know whether in the book or in some related researches of this project, there are some empirical kind of analysis being done. And one example, let's say from Asia, where I'm from, is the ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, which was established in 1967, and in its declaration, one of the very purposes is to promote regional peace. And then after that, in the 70s until the 90s and onwards, there are some analysts saying that with that kind of regional integration and more trade flow among those countries, there has been witnessing a serious kind of decline of conflicts and so on and so forth. So I don't know whether that would be a more positive way to look at the correlation between trade and peace. So thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Simon and Serge, you have the floor. I don't know who would like to go first. Serge, you wanna start?
Just if you like. So
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Go on, Simon. Go on.
Okay, I'll go. Let's look. Export-led growth by China has led to GDP. Whether they chose countries as an additional choice. It's clear, however, that choice is now being received and perceived very negatively by the United States, coupled with the various steps that the United States thinks that China is taking in the security and other domains. We are in a situation now where clearly there are decision makers in the United States who do not see trade as a positive sum game, but as a zero or negative sum game, where every gain by China is a loss by the United States. And that's the situation I think we're in. And I think it's not a situation I particularly like, but I think what I take from that is that the era that we have been through was pretty unique. It is unique in two important respects. One, that the hegemon didn't see a threat to its number one position. And two, that, and as Hamid has suggested, and Roberta hinted at too, that even if there were some countries rising up the pecking order and becoming larger and larger, that the other systems of global governance would somehow be in place to ensure that calm relations existed. And that clearly hasn't happened because the UN has fallen apart as well. So for all of these reasons, I think what I take from this is that the preconditions for the good times that we have enjoyed and all of us here have supported are probably over. And I think that's the conclusion I draw from this. The last comment I'll make is, Hamid asked, is this just a hegemon thing? I'm not so sure, because I think when I look at the behavior of Russia, Russia has not appeared to be particularly keen to have any of its neighbors successfully be both a democracy and successfully grow economically. And a large part of the growth, or part of the growth story, has been the integration of those neighbors with Western Europe. So I would argue that regional hegemons also find essentially the relative growth of their neighbors sometimes a threat, and that's clearly, I would argue, is clearly the case with Russia and Ukraine. So I don't think the argument's just a US-China one. I think what's happened is countries have started moving from thinking about their absolute performance and growth to their relative position, and once that happens, then this is very hard to sustain a positive sum view of international commerce. And that means we have to change our thinking about how trade and peace and tensions are related, and we should recalibrate our expectations about the future of the trading system accordingly.
Yeah. From my side, a few reflections. Also, what Axel said. You know, Axel, you mentioned Merz. telling that we are not at war, but not at peace, also. I think we need to be very careful there between what could be considered as a decent analysis of the situation and also a justification for the investments in the so-called deterrence and military preparedness. If we would really, if that's the analysis, if that's the conclusion of a decent analysis telling us, as a lot of intelligence services are telling us, that we might face war in Europe in 3 to 4 years from now, then I do not understand why we are still doing politics as usual. That should be the only file on your desk, right? So what are we talking about? A decent analysis with a decent strategic security analysis and coming to those conclusions, which would also lead to decent investments according to the priorities we need to set for ourselves? Or is this just finding excuses or finding justification for reinvestment in defense for Europe, mostly following the United States in this process, and if possible, buying U.S. equipment also? I think to answer both questions from Mahmoud and Roberta, I think the world, and I need to congratulate you, Simon, because I spent 2 years in the German Defense College, and you mentioned Clausewitz. I mean, you took that away from me. So, but yeah, well done. I think the world in which we live has changed, right? So we live now in this realist world. Maybe we need to rethink international relations. This is maybe even something different, but competition is central. The use of military is really allowed to really get to what you want to have. And I really need to come back to this idea of a world in which power, which is a capacity to influence or the capacity to impose to another, is central. And there is this idea of the zero-sum game, and as soon as you generate the realization or the ambition that you can get to the 10 instead of having the 0, I think a lot of the world leaders, of some world leaders today, would just go and make a move. And then there is also this part of a lack of rational thinking. When with IP, not this year, but I think 2 years ago, we made an evaluation of the potential economic impact of just a Taiwan blockade valid for 40%. This would have devastated financial and economic impact, especially on Taiwan, but also on China and definitely also on the global economy. So the decision, for example, for Russia to look at the state of Russian economy today compared to pre-war in Ukraine. So the decision really to go to war is not always a logic decision or rational decision. It's also a human, emotional decision from time to time. And of course, if you look at the economic impact, the impact on trade or whatever you would look at, it's never a good decision to go to war. It's never a good decision to use power in the military to achieve what you want to have. And when we look at what power is, and I think that's also important to understand what's happening everywhere in the world, but definitely in Europe, you have these different pillars of power. So I would call more the first, and it's a multiplication. I think that's very important to understand. The first part would be capacity. So what is the size of your country, of your population? Do you have access to oceans like the United States, for example? What is the size of your economy? Participation in the international relations, international organizations. So that's one thing. The second one would be the economic pillar of power. And the third one would be the military pillar of power. And if we would listen to Putin, we would have a fourth one, which would be culture, norms, and values, so to speak. And in the case of China, what we have seen is, of course, this almost explosion of the economic pillar of power, which started to overflow into the military and also generate a military ambition, or at least the use of the military in another set of international relations. And when we look at, and so that's one part of the multiplication. The other part of the multiplication is, do I have a strategy and do I have the political will to implement it? So, and I think this is where in Europe we have an issue. We don't know where we go, and therefore every road to get there is a good one. And I'm not sure that we really have the political will to address the situation as it is to us today. And therefore, even if Europe is second or third military power in the world, as such as Europe, not as individual countries, and even if Europe has the third economy in the world, it is still powerless in international relations. It has really no place at the negotiation table or the table. So that's something we need to understand. When we look at China, I think that and Simon, you mentioned it also, their attitudes in the past, I would say 26 years, because we need to refer to the strategy, which is a strategy of unrestricted warfare, which was developed in 1999. So by the time they went from a strategy into plans to develop from 2001, China, and then of course later Russia, because the Russian strategy or the Gerasimov doctrine is only a translation from the Chinese strategy, have been telling us how they see the world and how they want to influence the world. And what we see there is that this form of hybrid warfare. So China understand that head-to-head with the United States is impossible at all levels. So you need to find other ways to influence that. And when you look, for example, not at the global scale, but definitely at the regional scale, so when you look into the Indo-Pacific, you see that different assets, different approaches have been used to influence, first of all, the direct neighborhood. Second of all, now, and I think for me, as a kind of more security expert or a former military, I think this is the first time that when you look at the Indo-Pacific, you clearly see three lines of defense between the United States and China or Asia. China has left the first line of defense, which would be its shore, and moved to the first line of defense. And now we see that they also start to have development negotiation, but also political negotiation, use their power to pressure different islands and different governments in the Pacific to basically move to the second line of defense also. So there is some form of aggressive behavior, if you want to call it like this. Look at what is happening with the BRICS, the challenge of the US dollars as the reference currency, the Belt and Road Initiative, the string of pearls. I mean, even NATO has a problem in the Eastern Mediterranean because all the ports there are not into European hands anymore. They are all Chinese. And the same thing, which, this kill switch in the buses can happen also. I mean, it's already happening. We don't have access to own ports in Europe anymore if we would like to do that. So I think there is a strategy there. And what we have seen in the past 25 to 26 years. It's just the application of this strategy. And I was really struck, and that will be my last point, I was really struck this year that China came up with its 2049 strategy, and it did not even come in the news in Europe. Although, again, they are telling us how they look at international relations and the distribution of power in the world for the next 25 years. So I guess we can continue to have this discussion. If we do not look at the strategy and the implementation of it, we will always be surprised by the actions of our opponents, so to speak.
Serge, will this growth in expenditure also serve as a deterrent that this fragmentation will eventually return to some sort of normalcy, because there's a deterrent on both sides?
I think, I want to answer that question. It's an excellent question. I want to answer with two different answers. First of all, what we have seen, and that's published in this year's Global Peace Index, we have seen this more intense geopolitical fragmentation, where at the end of the Second World War, of the Cold War, 14 countries had the capacity to influence, so at a certain level of power. Today it's 34. So that's creating much more or many more friction zones throughout the world, where those relative powers are basically meeting each other, and therefore high level of conflict. And we all know that we're also facing other challenges, climate challenges, resources, rare earth, this kind of stuff, which is even more having a negative impact on this competition. So that is one part. But as I explained, for power, also for deterrence, there are two components. Look at the difference between. There is the component equipment, material. So basically, if you would look at that in a nuclear confrontation, an amount of nuclear warheads on both sides, and you try to create a balance. But the second component is there a political will to use the asset? And I think that's what, especially in Europe with Russia, I think that's what Russia is trying to test, is to see what is the resolve of NATO. How much are they sticking together? Are they really prepared to maybe go to war or to prepare for war? And I think that's what we need to understand, that both in the case of power, which is now central to international relations, but also in deterrence, there is this second component, which is like, do I have a strategy, and do I have the political will to use it? And I think that there are doubts about certain parts of the world if there is really the political will to go to war or to prepare for it. And the best example for that, if you have 5,000 warheads and you increase it to 200,000, but everybody knows you're never going to use the first one. well, it doesn't help. On the other hand, when you live in Pyongyang and you wake up every morning and you just want to press the red button and you have only half of a missile and half of a warhead, you're somehow also developing a form of power, because there is strong political will to use whatever you have. So I think we need to understand, and I think a lot of people, especially in Brussels, do not understand that there are two components to those approaches. Of course, the assets, of course, the investment, and of course the strategy. But there's also this idea of political will and strategy, knowing where you are and why you would like to use it.
Thank you, sir. I see Patrick has his hand up. I don't know if Simon, you wanted to add to that before. We'll take 3 more questions. So Patrick, you have the floor, and see who else will join.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure this is going to be very helpful, but when I look back at the work we were doing with you, Axel, on the paper on Liberia, one thing I took away from it, which I thought was actually really useful, was when you said something to the effect, you can correct me if I misunderstood you, you said something to the effect that what we learned about trade and peace in Liberia was that trade can be the source of conflict as well as the solution to conflict.
Yes.
And that this was very well shown, exposed in Liberia's experience. So that makes me think or ask, are there just too many omitted variables for us to be able to say anything definitive about how to learn from the past and to try to interpret the future? You know, all these different variables that are so important: power, political systems, strategic considerations, domestic distribution. There's so many different things, it seems to me, that means that so many omitted variables that any type of multiple aggression that gives us a solution is going to be as much guesswork as anything. I don't know. That sounds a horrible, defeatist, useless thing to say, but I just do wonder how much true learning we can do from what's happened in the past to avoid it occurring again in the future. Pessimistic, isn't it? But anyway.
Yeah. Maybe perhaps while we wait for other questions, Simon can respond, because I think he has to leave. Sorry, Jonathan has his hand up. So we'll take Jonathan's question and maybe then Simon can respond.
Jonathan, I don't think we can hear you.
We still can't hear you, Jonathan.
Maybe, Jonathan, you can put your question in the Q&A question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can read it out to the panel, maybe, if that helps, because we can hear you. Actually, it's the same on your side, right?
Yeah, I can hear you either. So maybe while we wait for Jonathan to adjust, maybe Simon, you wanna take a stab at
look, I think Patrick is right. By the way, I don't think it's a completely negative finding, because, you know, for years we've had this mantra that trade supported peace after World War II. And essentially, when you get into the weeds of each trade and peace episode, as this book and others have done, we find it's a lot more complex. So it should warn us against these mantras that we've adopted, I think. And, you know, and I think it also forces us to think, have we really got this? Have we really been seeing trade in the service of peace, or has really trade and the trading system been in the service of security interests? And I would argue the construction of the GATT after World War II and the exclusion of the United States' most important geopolitical threat, the Soviet Union, is an example actually of a construction of a trading system which served the West's security interests. So in other words, security drove the design of the trading system. Trade didn't necessarily contribute to peace. The trading system was subordinate. And I think that essentially we've gone through a phase where in recent years, until the recent tensions, where trade and security were on different paths, and now security has reasserted itself, and then we're back to where we were in prior decades. So I think the research is super valuable, and just possibly raising a red flag that the mantra that we've had, which by the way is repeated in the foreword of this book, might not be the best way of thinking about things going forward. Now I have to apologize. I have a meeting in about 5 minutes, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jonathan,
I
there we go.
I
We can
think
hear
I,
you now. Yeah.
I think I fixed the audio. Look, a very rich set of presentations and discussions so far. Let me build on Patrick's observation to ask a couple questions of clarification. For Serge, can you be a bit more granular on internal versus external conflict? Surely, regarding internal conflict, the issues are, as Simon says, as much, or as Patrick said, as much potentially distributional, the sense of exclusion, the response to those in power or the elites who aren't sharing properly, the claim, therefore, more tribal in nature, have very little to do with trade and more to do with how well the country is doing on good governance uh, at home. Trade may be an enabler by generating wealth more generally, but ultimately it boils down to how well it's distributed. Second question is to be careful about simply grouping all military expenditure together, since in this world of tensions, a good deal of it for many countries is defensive rather than offensive in nature. And if the theory of deterrence matters, it's not necessarily anti-peace to be spending on capacities purely for defensive purposes. So I'd want to be careful about that third. So ultimately, where I come out, and again, maybe I'm repeating in different words what Patrick has already said, trade overall is always a multiplier or an enabler. It's not a decisive factor alone in fostering either peace or prosperity, unless the other pieces, including the regulatory and political environment, are in place. So this is a very important discussion, but meriting, I think, further research and further granularity to get at causes, effects versus influences. I don't know if that generates any responses or comments.
Thanks, Jonathan. Serge, and I think Simon has left. So Serge? Oh, Simon.
Yeah, Simon is gone. So it's only me for the answers. I mean, excellent questions. I think for Patrick's question, I would almost say that we need to come back to human nature. If I would tell you water and access to water, the water resource, I think most of us would say, oh, this is going to lead to conflict because there's competitions, confrontation, and different groups wants to access the same well or the same source of water. Well, we just finished research for the World Bank on the positive aspect of the lack of water, where basically also groups and people and tribes and clans can come together, try to find solution, maybe negotiate, and eventually create a more peaceful environment around the lack of water or the limited access to water. Same for food, same for minerals, same for whatever type of resources also. I think when we, and I also already spoke about this non-rational choice for war or for the use of the military. I think it's always a political choice, but very short-sighted. Yes, maybe you can access this type of resource, or you can exercise your power, but what I see, without wanting to criticize him, but for example, when President Trump, when we look at almost the first year of his presidency, yes, the America has developed a lot of power. Yes, he used it, but he kind of arm wrestled every of his decisions. And he kind of forced a lot of countries, a lot of partners into a position that they maybe did not always want to be in. So in the very short term, he might have achieved what he's calling peace. He might have achieved solutions for maybe basically several conflict, or even maybe a relationship between countries, when I think about Azerbaijan and Armenia, for example. But I'm not really sure that in the long term, something has been built. Something has been developed. And this brought me back to we are now in the process of establishing a Northern Irish Peace Index, and basically look at what's really not been settled in 27 years and what can be settled in Northern Ireland in the future. And the remark that has been made in the very beginning about Northern Ireland and the use of trade, or even more, absolutely, this would have been the key to bring more peace into Northern Ireland. But what do we see currently in Northern Ireland is that the political parties basically are very well served by the violent status quo. Because just imagine if we would have more peace, they would just disappear from the political spectrum, because you would go to a normal political spectrum from far left to right, and not this opposition between two groups. When you look at the peace processes, I was in Belfast twice in the past 2-3 months, and I couldn't tell myself, when they showed me the interfaces between the different groups and these high fences, I was like, this is not a peace agreement. This was a segregation agreement. And I spent 3 years of my life in Bosnia in the 90s, which is exactly the same. The Dayton agreements, that's not a peace agreement. It's a segregation agreement. You take the fighting, the warring parties, you separate them, and then the fighting is over, but the war is not over. The conflict is not solved. And of course, when you look, it's the same in 90s, the same group of people who negotiated both agreements, or at least the input to both agreements. So this made me think about research that has been done, I think, by the Graduate Institute under Maika Oshikawa's leadership, where they basically look at the peace agreements and the trade agreements from the past, I think 50 to 70 years, and they look at a peace component in the trade agreement and a trade component in the peace agreement, and this was in the vast majority of this agreement completely missing. And I think that's a big mistake. You need to be much more have a much more whole-encompassing approach to peace, and trade is a part of that. And I think that's something we definitely need to understand. Difference between internal and external conflict. Well, I could easily get away with this and say inside the borders and outside the borders, Jonathan, but that's not the answer you are waiting to get from me. But that's basically it. Although I need to admit, if you want to go into granularity, that it's nowadays very, very difficult to continue to really make a difference between both, because usually one evolves into the other. I mean, look at Syria, for example. It all started internally when, different seasons of drought. A lot of people from the countryside started to go to the cities. The internal security could not match it anymore, and then pam. And then once it was still an internal conflict, then it started to be regional and then global, and then we have the situation we still have today with Syria also. So there is this potential for internal conflict to also emerge into external conflict. When we look at internal conflict, we also look at disputes. It's not always like we're not always fighting. It's not always like casualties on both sides, but also dispute between clans or between tribes, or when there's a lack of peace inside societies also. You're absolutely right, and I really like your remark about that military expenditure is not always offensive, defensive. I understand all this. The point we try to I basically came from 30 years in the military, and then I started to work for this peace measuring think tank. And I think we're not those kind of fluffy people who have this utopic view of a world without military or a world without police or every peace and law all over. I think we understand that it's not. You put two people together, you need a third one to manage the relationship between those two people. That's absolutely correct. What we are aiming for is basically to have the minimum required number of military and investment in military and in police forces. If you let the world go the direction it's going at the moment, you will only see an increase in investment in defense and in the military. So the point we try to make is the point that I made when I spoke about positive peace. If you can invest in peace and create more stable societies, like individual societies, but also a global society, I think then we can create a world in which we will still need violence containment. But if we decrease the potential for violence, we can also decrease the potential for violence containment assets in which we need to invest. And just imagine what you could do if you would take 1 or 10% of this 20 trillion we invest in violence last year, and you invest that in the economies, in development, or whatever positive initiatives you want to invest in. You would create a different world in which you would need less of this military and and police forces, for example. Last point, I spoke about these 34 countries which have the capacity to influence these friction zones. 200 countries in the world today, which means, as you have said also, Axel, before, the majority of the countries do not want the situation in which we live at the moment. Do not want do not choose for the direction the world is heading to at the moment. I think that's something we need to understand also. And the last point about multilateralism, because that has been that was part of the questions also. I think we need to be very careful, because when we look at those 34 countries, or those who really see the world as a realist battle space, they see the multilateral world, or the multilateral assets, as part of this zero-sum game, and they will only invest in it or use it when it's going to serve their interests. And therefore try to get specific posts within the UN or other organizations to be able to basically force the. I remember I was in Taiwan about close to a decade ago, maybe 7 or 8 years, and back in the days more than around 25 countries were still recognizing Taiwan. Now we are down to 10 or 11 or even less. That all happened within the UN, and the connections and making sure that the votes were going to the right direction. So we need to be very careful that the multilateral system that we are all advocating for, and I think is a guarantee for peace also. We need to make sure that it is used for its purpose and not within the zero-sum game that we are living in at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey, and I know Simon is. Thank you all for participating. I think. As you were speaking, I thought about two things in terms of the U.S. One factor, as Patrick spoke about, there's so many factors to consider when measuring peace and the implications of trade. We didn't really touch on elections and the election cycles and the implications to the global trading system, to global security. And so that's my hope, that elections when pushed to one extreme of the spectrum, tend to have a counterbalance that push votes to the opposite direction. And so my hope is that election will hopefully happen. Elections do happen across. We've seen more extreme because many economies, including industrialized economies, are facing real developing countries challenges. I used to live in California, and then the unemployed population in California. There are parts of California you would never imagine that people in Africa, in some of those poor areas, may be living better than people in parts of California. You have a whole Midwest of America that basically feel disenfranchised, that they're not a part of the America prosperity story, and so that's pushing their votes in one direction. But the shock of the approach of reforms, I'm beginning to see cracks begin to shock people, so much so that they're seeing that the social benefit systems are now under attack for this sort of reform process, that it may begin to push vote in the opposite direction. So I think one variable that is out there that is a variable of hope is that the elections do happen, and you have these election cycles where you have winner take all approach, and they go too far right, and they end up pushing the general population in the other direction that will come to try to stabilize where we go globally. I mean, China remains a stable giant with its projections 100 years into the future of where it needs to be, to really lock down resources. And you see the implications in Africa, where there's a rush to secure natural resources all across the continent. And so I think we have to be hopeful that elections do happen, and it could be a stabilizing effect that could also swing the pendulum in an opposite direction. When you see people who are super conservative now beginning to feel the pinch of some of these reforms that are now speaking out loud with regret, I think is going to have implications down the road. And so with that, I want to say thank you for the thought-provoking conversation, and thanks to all of you for staying on. I know we're a little bit over the time, and thanks to Lou and the WTO team, the Trade for Peace team, whom I must say I'm always proud to be a part of this journey. I like to say trade matters in especially developing countries, where wars aren't so sophisticated and wars are tribal and local for the most part. And so trade driving inclusion and by improving governance structures and institutions, you can see trade deliver a peace dividend in many instances with the backing of strong external partners. Now, the backing of strong external partners these days it's a zero-sum game for a rush for raw materials. And so that is fueling some of the conflict we see in the developing countries. But I'm hopeful that elections do happen and it can swing the tide in the opposite direction and bring some stabilization. Thank you all. I know it's been a long evening for all of you. Thank you, Sergey, for always an insightful conversation. And thanks to Simon. Thank you.
Axel,
Thank you.
yeah, I just want to bring to your attention that Maika Oshikawa, who is Director of Accession behind this project, is here. So we should all thank her.
Micah. Thank you.
She has done. Maika, you want to say a few words before close down?
No, not much. No. Thank you. No, I couldn't really follow everything. I'm connecting from Japan with my internet connection is a little bit on and off. Well, thanks to Lou for proposing to have this conversation, trade, for peace or trade and peace within the FMG. So really appreciate. I think you've, seen lots of generated, good discussion, different views. And then I really feel that, yeah, I think more conversation is needed. I also heard what Simon said as well. So let's see, how we can carry this conversation. All I can say is when we started Trade for Peace, for the context of, in the accession and focusing on fragile conflict affected state, I think the world was much more peaceful place. Now we live in a different world, but maybe I still believe, I think there is a room for trade to play the positive part of to play a positive role to promote peace. So maybe we need a sort of a second volume, Patrick, to work on the future of a Trade for Peace. Thank you very much, Lou, and everyone. Thank you, Serge and Simon.
Thank you.
And Roberto.
Patrick, you have work to do now.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.